As an adventure touring rider, I enjoy playing around in the dirt, but I also love riding on asphalt and doing long-distance touring. These days though, modern adventure bikes cost 12, 13, 14 or sometimes well over 20,000 euros. Fortunately, the CF Moto 800 MTX breaks that pattern with a price tag below 10,000 euros. But how much adventure bike do you actually get for the money? Hello from Spain, where we've shortened the winter season and extended the testing season. That means we're here for 6 weeks in the Barcelona area testing the motorcycle novelties of 2026, as well as models we barely got to ride or didn't get to ride enough in 2025. And that includes the CF Moto 800 MTX. My Swiss colleague Frankie already tested it, but somehow it never really made it to us in Austria. So it's all the nicer that we have it here in Spain. And to be fair, for an adventure bike that also wants to spend a not insignificant amount of time on loose terrain, Austria might not be the ideal playground anyway. In principle, what do you need to know about the CF Moto 800 MTX? It was created through the cooperation between KTM and CF Moto. At its heart, it basically has a licensed version of KTM's 790 parallel twin. You can also see the KTM influences in the low-slung 22.5 liter tank, which reaches far down and is very good for the center of gravity. But riding impressions, we'll get to those in a moment. The engine still has 799 cubic centimeters. Internally, the engine itself is basically identical to the one in the 790 Adventure. However, CF Moto took control of things like the intake ports, exhaust system and engine management, so there are definitely differences. That's also why we get a slightly changed maximum output of 91 horsepower and 86 Newton meters of torque. And how well this Chinese reinterpretation works in the different areas of use, everyday riding, touring, country roads, corner carving and also off-road play, you can already see it's properly dirty. We dare to take it into the weeds a bit. That's what I'll tell you now. And we'll start with the pragmatic side, everyday use. The riding position is typical adventure bike. That means we've got a high handlebar with risers here as well, so it's raised even further. The arms go straight to this wide handlebar, you can see it, very upright. At the same time, the bike is nicely narrow around the waist. I'm 1.85 meters tall. We're standing on slightly uneven ground here with an 873 millimeter seat height. But for me, getting my feet down is no challenge. Maybe for shorter riders it could be. But because it's so narrow here in the middle, the step-over arc is quite short. And the center of gravity is also favorable. According to the manufacturer, it weighs 220 kilograms ready to ride. That means it's easier to manage while standing still and maneuvering than a comparable adventure bike in this weight class that has its tank mounted conventionally up top. But CF Moto also offers a seat that is 4 centimeters lower plus a lowering kit. So if you really want to ride the 800 MTX but you're on the shorter side, there is an option. What also stands out while seated is that the knee angle is relatively sharp for a touring-oriented machine like this. That's probably because they wanted to provide enough lean angle clearance for fun cornering. I still think it's okay, but if you're really tall, you'll have to check whether it might be a touch too tight over long distances. The steering lock is nicely wide, so maneuvering in the city or maybe even threading through columns of cars, at least here in Spain, is no problem. The clutch operation is also nice and light. The lever is even adjustable. We mustn't forget with almost everything we're discussing today what an extremely low price class we're in here. I mean, just as a small comparison, here we have a full-size proper adventure bike with 91 horsepower for 9,999 euros in Austria, and Suzuki asks roughly the same money for the DRZ4S in Austria with 38 horsepower and without features, wind protection and so on. So you probably get a lot for the money here. The only question is, how well does it work? Throttle response, at least initially, is very relaxed, not too aggressive. Riding modes are standard, rain and off-road. Even in standard mode, I find it very easy to manage Also for the city, maybe even with a bit less experience in the throttle hand. Sound-wise, it's not too intrusive either. I'd say it's a touch bassier than on the 790 Adventure. Suspension comfort, we have 230 millimeters of travel front and rear, fully adjustable. And here too, it's pretty good. It's not tuned too softly, which will become especially relevant later when riding a bit more dynamically. But it's still comfortable enough to roll over speed bumps, manhole covers and so on in the city without stress. Last point in the city, the quickshifter. Also fitted as standard for this money. It works very well in 90% of cases. Only here and there it simply refuses. I couldn't quite reproduce when it happens. To me, it seemed most common somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 revs when the quickshifter just didn't want to cooperate, usually when trying to shift up. Apart from that, the gear changes are quite crisp and precise. If you shift with the clutch, the gearbox itself also feels pretty good. Only between first and second gear is it a little bit vague. It can also be difficult, for example, to find neutral, but the quickshifter is not the only equipment feature that you usually only find as standard on much more expensive motorcycles. First of all, we have this nice 8-inch TFT display in portrait format. It's reasonably easy to read, although here and there I do think the font might be quite small for people with slightly weaker eyesight. But what you can also see down here, we even have tire pressure sensors and tire temperature sensors on board. So that's already another feature. At the same time, here on the left handlebar, cruise control standard. We have an adjustable windscreen. Fairly simple but nice to have, and also small practical things like USB-A and USB-C ports, so power outlets on board. But how is the touring comfort with all these many features? I'd say it's okay. The suspension damps decently, really sharp hits still come through a bit more clearly, so these very fast suspension movements are more noticeable than on higher quality suspension systems, but it's still fine. Everything in the medium speed range is ironed out cleanly in my opinion. Seat comfort, at least for the not overly long stages I rode here, was okay. Riding position felt comfortable for me. Wind protection with the screen adjusted upward. At my height, I still get turbulence from around eye level to forehead level, and I think these raised sections on the side are meant to take wind pressure away from the shoulders and upper torso. That works on the torso. But even with my really slim build, I can still feel the wind brushing my shoulders. So if you're a properly built man, you'll definitely be standing in the wind a bit here. One point you could criticize is that the payload is a bit low. We have a maximum permitted total weight of 405 kilograms. With a vehicle weight of 220 kilograms, that means 185 kilograms can be added. So if you like traveling with a passenger and then maybe luggage as well, you'll have to manage the weight a bit. Enough pragmatism. Let's get to the fun part, and first of all on asphalt. Here in Spain there are fantastic roads. We've been here for several years now, always in February and March, and we already know the really tasty bits here in Catalonia. Some of them you'll also get to see live from the saddle, because we've made moto vlogs with every bike tested here in Spain. So maybe subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything, or just browse through the channel page. There's also a moto vlog with this bike, mixed on-road and off-road, where I almost binned it, so that might be exciting to watch. But now let's talk a bit more soberly about the riding impressions. The first thing you notice, of course, is again the low center of gravity. It simply creates very willing turn-in behavior. Despite the serious adventure wheel setup with 90/90/21 at the front and 150/70 on an 18-inch rim at the rear. These tires here are from CST, and I would describe them as 80/20 tires. And we actually rode them the whole time with slightly reduced air pressure, which should normally make the handling more sluggish. Nevertheless, the bike turns in extremely willingly, needs very little input, but isn't hyper agile either. Instead, it builds lean angle in a very harmonious way. The suspension also gives relatively good feedback from the tires, in my opinion. Of course, it dives a little when you brake into a corner, but the damping behavior is nicely progressive. And that gives me confidence somehow. Speaking of brakes, the brake itself also has a fairly soft pressure point, and you can feel the off-road focus here. You can brake harder when riding sportily on the road, but you need quite a lot of hand force for that. And honestly, if you want to brake sharply, it's worth stepping on the rear brake a bit as well. At least for me, that helps. I'd say the brake feel was okay, the progression was also okay, but up front, it simply needs quite a lot of force. Once you get a feel for the bike and how it behaves, you can really slice through corners nicely at lean. Lean angle clearance is also properly okay, I think. More than enough for plenty of fun. And then after the corner, you bring the bike upright again and twist the throttle. So is this engine as awesome as the 790 twin in the KTM? Because for me, that was always a fascinating engine. Continued, of course, with the 890 and 990 versions. But in my world, it started with the 790, and I found it so fascinating because on the one hand, it was an engine with extremely strong drive already from relatively low revs, and then especially in the mid-range, it produced a lot of torque. But at the same time, it combined that with real willingness to rev, so the engine felt fun at almost any RPM, and you could really ride it hard and enjoy it. Is it the same in the CF Moto? Not quite, I would say. To me, the engine feels more tamed down low, with less torque, less punch. And only from around 6,000 revs upward does a more vehement punch suddenly arrive compared to the lower rev range. So I'd say this engine wants to be revved a bit more, or should be revved more, up toward the limiter at around 9,000 revs, rather than shifting in the middle because you already have so much torque. That didn't necessarily reduce the riding fun, but if I had to say where the engine worked better, I'd say in the KTM. Now we come to my favorite area, playing in the dirt, off-road riding. We didn't ride any truly demanding terrain, more like easy to medium easy. Once during the moto vlog, I suddenly ended up on a rougher trail, still a gravel road, but a rougher one, so I think it was enough for a good impression. And that impression confirms once again, in my opinion, that the most important thing for a good riding feel off-road, at least for me, is good ergonomics first and foremost. And the 800 MTX nails that perfectly, at least for my height. It's a good balance between touring-oriented and still offering space for some activity while standing. I mean, you can cruise along a gentle gravel highway completely relaxed, with no pressure on your hands and a relatively straight back, and you have hardly any effort or tension in your body beyond the bit you should always have anyway. So I think you could ride long distances standing up like this, but at the same time, because of how the tank is shaped, the narrowness of the bike in the middle, and also the distance between the foot pegs and handlebar, you have the space you need when the track gets a bit more demanding or when you feel like pushing. You can open the throttle and still move nicely over the foot pegs, use the wide handlebar, your hips and weight transfer, and let the bike dance over obstacles. I simply really liked that. Instant feel-good factor. The suspension was also decent again. Only when riding at speed over larger waves or bumps did it feel like the mass of the bike hit the obstacle with a lot of momentum, and then there was a small afterbounce. Not immensely long, but at least one rebound movement at the rear and a little bit at the front as well. But I found that acceptable because at medium speed the handling was really nicely controllable, manageable and transparent. Even though it has less punch than in the 790 Adventure from KTM, there is still enough torque to break traction quickly. For my riding ability, I found it fun enough. Of course, I can imagine that if someone is a really excellent off-road rider, permanently riding with power drifts and wheelies and generally with a riding style where you want or need that power and especially that immediate torque, then it could bother them. But I think for probably 90% of riders out there, the engine is more than strong and lively enough to have fun on loose terrain. The stock tires, unknown to me until now, CST Ambro A42. I think most people will probably fairly quickly fit a better known tire or one from a product line they trust. The dimensions are suitable for that. But in principle, the tire was okay with slightly reduced pressure. Not an excessive amount of lateral grip, but for the terrain we rode, especially mostly in the dry, no problem at all. I learned something new. I always thought that if the spokes are in the middle of the rim, it's a tube-type tire, and if they're on the outside, it's tubeless. But no, we actually have tubeless rims here. It's just a special type of rim construction. You can see this raised section here, and the spokes are specially sealed as well. So tubeless rims on the 800 MTX. And with the hard hits I had on the rougher track, I was also glad about another equipment detail that is not common in this price class. We have a steering damper fitted. The rear tire didn't suffer too much, even though quite a bit of mischief was done. Traction control is very easy to switch off using the function button on the left handlebar and then pressing through twice, and you're there. You don't have submenus like on KTM, which I don't mind at all. Traction control comes from Bosch, ABS also comes from Bosch and can also be deactivated for a bit of rear wheel drifting and so on. And why did the rear tire suffer? Well, certainly not because of me. Bernd, you really let loose with the CF Moto 800 MTX, both on the road and then on loose terrain. Now in your home country Germany, you can get it for under 9,000 euros. Does the riding experience fit this affordable price class, or is it maybe even above this price class?
Off-road, you really have to say this bike can do a lot. There are a few little things where I'd say in terms of feel, pressure point, especially the rear brake, and here and there a small dropout, mainly from the engine management. That's in quotation marks the only criticism. But otherwise, it's basically a proven concept, more or less what you know from KTM, and with a few small compromises, a very nice bike that you can really let rip on.
Can you describe that a bit more? I also tried to put it into words, but maybe you can do it even better. What exactly about the engine behavior? You know the KTM adventure models very well. In comparison, where is it lacking? In which rev range? Is it power? Is it willingness to rev? Is it simply smooth engine behavior? What are you missing?
Well, clearly the KTM 890 naturally has quite a bit more torque. On the one hand, the power, but sure, power is always secondary. This bike simply doesn't have the same output, so that's not the point. It's more the engine management when you apply throttle, where there are still small delays, a little jerk somehow, where you could maybe fine-tune the software a bit more. You can feel that minimally. Nothing that couldn't be fixed, but as it stands now, it's not quite perfect yet.
We also talked about this, not just how it behaves when revving out, but also that it happened to both of us. With me, I often think maybe it was user error, but since you noticed it too, I now dare to bring it up. The bike sometimes tends to plop out, so it unexpectedly stalls or cuts out. When did that happen to you?
Especially right at the beginning when I first started off twice in a row. Then you noticed a bit that the clutch is quite sharp and you have to adapt to it. Give it just a touch more throttle when starting off, let's say. Especially because we were standing on a slope where we were doing the action shots. And once I adapted to that, it actually worked quite okay. But it's not something where you say, okay, you can just sit on it without thinking and ride off. Then it's more like you'll definitely stall the engine once or twice. So adapt a little, have good clutch feel, and give it a touch more throttle. Then it worked.
You had both wheels in the air a few times with the CF Moto, so you definitely worked the suspension much harder than I did. How was the response, the reserves, and then also when you reach the limits of the suspension, how far can you go with the 800 MTX?
You can go surprisingly far. In the end, it's actually a bike meant for riding dirt roads. We did significantly more than a dirt road. So the question is always, how far should you go? I'm not called an expert for nothing, so of course I like to go one step further. And you could notice that the suspension, especially on rebound, so how quickly the bike extends again, was relatively fast, especially at the rear shock. Once the suspension warmed up a bit, the rear of the bike kicked back slightly after a few jumps. In terms of response, I actually found it quite good. That worked well, but once the suspension, especially the shock, got warm, that's where the rebound damping was lacking a bit, and the bike kept kicking slightly from the rear.
The different areas of use, and now we're slowly coming to the conclusion. And the most important question is, do you notice the low price? Because if you don't notice it, then you can buy this bike with a clear conscience and ask yourself why others pay 1.5 to twice the price for a comparable motorcycle. But I have to say, of course, you do notice it in some corners and details, whether it's the fact that everything here is plastic or that the feel of the controls isn't as nice as on more expensive models. We have this much on the clock and we're already seeing slight signs of failure, for example, with the indicator switch, which no longer deactivates quite as easily. The question is simply, how much does that bother you? Because as we've heard now, the riding performance is definitely passable to clearly better than passable. So how much does it bother you that the surrounding components don't feel quite as premium, that the display doesn't look quite as beautiful as on the big manufacturers' more expensive models? You can also still change things afterwards. If you buy a bike like this, you probably still have budget left over, and then you can optimize a little. For example, mount a larger windscreen, add wind deflectors, swap brake pads, and so on. Small things that can make a difference and still don't cost the amount you would have had to pay extra for a comparable motorcycle from more expensive manufacturers. My conclusion, what I take away from the 800 MTX, is that the bike simply works well on the road in everyday use and for touring. But where it really shines and where it really convinced me was off-road. Of course, it would be interesting to see what the robustness is like in the long run, especially off-road, with vibrations, possible drops and crashes. Of course, the material is stressed there, and the question is, if more affordable materials are used, can the bike handle that? But so far, at least in our short test, everything was perfectly fine, and the riding feel was simply very good. Overall, I can only say, yes, the value for money really is very interesting, but you have to be the right type of rider for it. So now I'm interested, how do you see the potential of the 800 MTX? Write it in the comments along with any questions you may have. And if you like the effort we're putting in here in Spain and you enjoy the videos, then maybe leave a thumbs up. All I can say is thanks for watching. Check out the other Spain videos as well, and hopefully we'll see each other again soon. Take care. Bye bye. Adios.